Is testing 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. I've got a light here. I've got a light here. I've got no light here. I've got no no sound here. Also, I see no. You can hear me. You can hear me fine. I don't see anything on my end that tells me that the sound. Okay. Okay. If we're working, we're working. Thank you very much, Lee's Trees. I wonder if it was working. I wonder if it was working the first time I killed stream. That's okay. There was some stuff in the details I hadn't filled in also. Hello world. Patricia O'Connor, Frida Reba Darcy, Bonsai Balcony. Tonight we are in Frida's place. Do me a favor. I'm kind of operating blind here for whatever reason. I'm getting no feedback on the sound end of my monitor. So tell me, I'll keep an eye over here. Tell me if I lose sound at some point. At some point, tell me if I lose sound, and we'll accommodate. We'll do something to fix it. Okay, tonight's little convo is about. Oh, also, sorry we're a little bit late. It's starting to get later, dark later here, and I kind of dilly dally around. I like it to be Saturday Night Live and not sunset in my eye line while I'm trying to start the show. So we waited till about 7:30 to even get started, which meant that we ended up uh, going to like a 8:15 kickoff or something. I don't know. That was kind of, but yeah, that's kind of why we're gonna get later starts, and unless we hear that somebody somewhere just already up some enormous amount of time to try to watch this. I don't know that I'll necessarily do it any different because I kind of would like it to be a an after sunset show anyway. It's just kind of a vibe, right? So tonight what we're going to talk about is puns and more specifically single and multi-flush puns. And maybe not single and multi-flush pines as much as ponderosa pines, and uh, and then our multi-flush pine is Japanese black pine. But to some degree, uh, he, but to some degree, hi Jay, how are you? Uh, to some degree, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about when we talk about multi-flush pines or Japanese black pines, that would also pertain to red pines. And some of the stuff that we're going to talk about when we talk about our ponderosa would also pertain to is close to the same that you would do with a white pine or a Scots pine. And basically, uh, what are we when it comes to pines? Different trees act different ways and survive in different ways. Pines store their energy, their power comes from the roots. That is, as opposed to junipers. Not a big juniper grower so far. So don't have a lot of junipers. But they tell me that as opposed to pines, junipers store their all of their energy comes from their foliage. So and with pines, it's in the roots. But we dictate and we can make sure we can balance this energy by messing with the by how we train the foliage and how we do the candles and how we do the needles and when we do all of these things. But it's different depending on whether or not it's a single flush pine or a multi flush pine. In a single flush pine, you wouldn't cut candles and get a second flush guaranteed every time. You would get back buds sometimes sporadically, sometimes not. It would sometimes it would kill off. So there's a process to do that. And with multi-flush pines, we wait until it's candle cutting time. We typically let those needles elongate out, and but before they have a chance to harden off, and then we clip them. And when we do that, we clip all of it. Some people used to do a thing where on the strongest part of the tree, you snip this much of it, and on the weakest part of the tree, you hi Paul, and on the weaker part of the tree, you leave more of a candle, or maybe some other people had a variation of that where earlier in the year you get rid of this much of the candle, later part of the year you go to the middle part of the tree and get rid of this much. Get rid of the candles all at the same time as per the size of the tree. The bigger the tree, now this is on a multi-flush. The bigger the tree, the the longer you're going to wait into candle. I mean, the sooner you're going to go into candle cutting season. If it's a big tree, then you're going to want smaller needles, but they're going to be towards the larger end. So you would go early, giving your tree the most time to regrow. In that candle growing season, giving your tree the most time to regrow those needles. Why do pines react differently? Why do we have pines that are single flush and why do we have pines that are multi flush? It has to do with where they adapted. Japanese black pines were coastal pines. They had adapted in an environment where high winds and beach environment could literally strip them bare. So this time of season, um, is the time of year whenever if it loses every needle on it and all of its candles, it'll come back with the second flush. It's adapted to do that. Farther up in the hill country, red pines have adapted to do the same thing. They're not as strong as black pines. Black pines are considered to be very masculine trees, but they're also very, very strong trees. A testament to that, I came within a whisker of killing a Japanese black pine a couple of years ago. It was very scary, but I got right up to the brink before I decided to do something was better than nothing, and um, and I still have that tree today. But it was they're hardy. I mean, they can take a licking and keep on ticking, as they say. Whereas the red pines, they're not thought to be as strong as that. You don't necessarily cut the needles back as hard. You let them. You're supposed to let them go a little longer in the season, and then when you cut them, I believe you're supposed to leave a little. That way, it will back bud. Um, and I think white pines is a completely different system again, but you're not likely to cut all the candle off of a white pine because that I think kills the end of the branch. I don't have a lot of white pines, but my single flush experience tends to lean more in the ponderosas. This is one of two Yamadori ponderosas that I have. It's a it's a single flush pine. So my multi flush pine is a Japanese black pine that I got from Jonas at Bonsai tonight. He had raised it from seed, and I typically refer to this as my 17-year from seed Japanese black pine. For 3 years now, I've been referring to this. So this is now my 20-year from seed, as per Jonas, Japanese black pine. And it gets its needles, it gets its candles cut, it gets its needles thinned. So why do we cut candles? Why do we cut candles on multi-flush pine? And a lot of times you'll hear people say, and some of them will even say this as a secondary answer. They'll say the right thing, and then they'll add this to it, and they'll add for back budding. And the honest answer on back budding is, if you really want a tree to back bud, don't cut the candles. Let it grow candles, feed it, water it, let it photosynthesize with all the stuff that it has. It'll turn that into roots. It'll turn those roots into back buds. So if it were the point where in candle cutting to get more back buds, there's a better way. What we tend to say is we were told to do candles, and as a result, when we do candles, we do send to see that the tree responds by back budding. They do, but that's kind of secondary. And like I said, if you wanted to get back butts, there's a more direct way. Go direct. The reason we do candles is so that we can dictate needle length. Short needles, shorter needles also make for shorter inner nodes from year to year. Longer needles make for longer inner nodes, and that's why we see a lot of Yamadori with real long, gangly branches because nobody's ever, nature doesn't mind that a bit. That's what it does. So that's kind of the point on multi-flush pines to doing the candles is so that we can get shorter needles and shorter inner nodes. After we so basically this is the thing. What we want to do is feed our trees. Let's say it's fall. The needles that have grown back on our Japanese black pine from when we last did some work to it have elongated all the way out as far as they're going to go and they've hardened off. We know this because it's late in the game, late in the year. The points to the needles are firm. The color is going to be a dark, deep, good green, right? Also, if you gave them a little tug, if they're adolescent needles or still coming out needles, you could pull them out really easy. If they're set, they're set. That's a hardened off needle. That's the time of the year. Now that's the time of year when we can start feeding our pines again because they haven't been fed during candle cutting season. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's when we resume feeding. And a lot of people at winter stop feeding. I don't. We still get our trees don't go 100% dormant here. We're still growing roots and stuff. I still feed them. I don't know. I may find out somebody may say that's bad, but I don't know of anybody who goes through our Bay Area winters who for sure quits feeding their trees in winter. But here's what: come spring, we start watching that. We're gonna. It's the most important time to feed uh, your multi-flush pines is in spring because 30 days, about 30 days before you cut those candles on that Japanese black pine, you're going to want to pull up. You're going to want to pull up your fertilizer, which is to say that if you're using an organic fertilizer and you've got these little packets or these little golf ball looking things, or you're like me and you've got those little lumps laying up there, about 30 days before I'm going to do the candles on this tree, I'm going to want to pull all that stuff up so that with every watering, I'm watering out more and more and more of those nutrients. When I come through, when it comes needle cutting time, we're going to have the tree in more of an energy neutral state. It's not going to be overfed. So that when we go through and lop off those candles, it'll start making its second flush of candles, but it's not going to have as much energy on reserve. And us not feeding it goes a long way towards making sure that that's so. If we still had a lot of fertilizer in the system, it would go, well, lucky for us, you cut all of our candles off, but lucky for us, we still had this stash here behind the couch that we're, this bag of Cheetos behind the couch here, we're going to chew, you know, and so then you would still get long needles. It would have completely defeated the purpose. So you pick up your fertilizer, let all, or if you're synthetic and you're fertilizing your trees that way, you kind of knock that off and let your watering start running that through your trees until for about 30 days, and then once you've done that, then we go through and we cut all of the candles all at once, the whole candle, the whole thing. Look, that whole candle. Leave just a tiny little bit of green, but none of those, and there's going to be a little space where the needles stop and you've got a little green gap. Get it right in there and try to, and if you can get it even, that's better. Um, And if you do something that I did early going, trying to go in with scissors at different angles and stuff, and you nick other buds, yes, you'll definitely see that later. That will definitely, if you're like, oh, I hope that's going to be okay. Yes, it will be okay. And yeah, you will see it later. Um, so that takes us to candle cutting season. This is also a time when we're going to look at the tree and decide what it wants versus what we need. So this is a healthy tree. It's a happy tree. We've been feeding it. We've been feeding it in fall, and then we fed it because it's in the Bay Area. We fed it. A lot of people would take fertilizer up in the winter. The theory being the tree's dormant. Why are you feeding your tree? I don't think our trees go completely dormant here. Anyway, I'm getting back on that. So come spring, that's an important time to make sure everybody's getting fed because we're about to put them on a diet. And then we pick up the food, and then 30 days after that we go through and we do all of our candles top to bottom. And then at that point we look at the overall condition of the tree. We look at the strong parts and we look at the weak parts. On most trees, they want to be top dominant at the top of every bud, like in the silhouette at the top of every bud. There's a hormone that collects at the bud tips. Inside that bud tip, those hormones collect. And what those hormones tell, what they say to the rest of the plant, is that they're the top. Buds down here will be smaller because this hormone is in these tips up here. And that hormone is called auxin. So when we pinch the tips, we're taking that auxin. And that will cause these buds down here to get a new lease on life. That's a really good way. You've heard me talk about that when it comes to my oaks. My oaks are all about that game. They definitely know when something is nipped off the end of a branch and everybody else can go for broke. So all right. So that's got us there. We have evaluated our tree, and now we're looking and we're seeing that as per most trees, the top it wants to be it wants to be dominant in the top. So that's where the densest amount of foliage is going to be. Down here, we're going to see less of that. So what we want to do is we're not going to pick a branch that's the weakest part of the tree, but we're going to point, or we're going to find the weakest structure branch, you know, not that entirely weak little thing that's off in the side that doesn't get enough light or something. You can probably find one on a tree somewhere, every tree, but the weakest part of the main structure somewhere on usually the lower part of the tree. And we want to look at those needle counts. We're going to go through and maybe reduce that a very little. Now we're going to look at how many needles we have in that area. And we're going to go to the top and start reducing those needles down to that. And when we have the needle count up here per area, per area, per area, per area, all the way down, all the way around, then that's balancing the energy of the tree. And we typically do this after we do the candles because one, we're already there doing the candles. Sometimes when you're new at this, you'll miss candles. And whenever I did this, I went, yeah, I may have missed a few candles. And they went, yeah, you most certainly did. I can see them from here. And I went, I don't. And they went, you'll see them in a minute, which is to say, once they start growing out, you will. You'll live. The tree will live. You'll get better. All of those things. But once you've done that, it's easier to make sure you've gotten all the candles when you've already spent this much time over the top of the tree, going over it from top of the bottom, kind of, not counting every needle on the tree, but you're looking at 9, 12 needles per cluster or something. And you basically see that and move on to the next one and move on to the next one and move on to the next one. It'll take you about as long to do that probably as it would take you to do the candles. But in the process, you probably would miss less candles if you did all of those together. And that's probably one of the reasons why we tend to do both of those things together. So having done that, you've pretty much done your candles, you've done your needle thinning, and then what the tree will do is it will respond by making a whole bunch of more. It'll back bud. The thing that we said is not the reason why we do it. Well, it will back bud. Another thing about that is not everybody wants back buds. Some trees are refined and they're going enough with the back buds. So when you cut the candles and the tree takes one and turns it into two, between two and maybe eight, because healthy trees will do that. They'll put out a poof, there's five. You took one, boom, there's five of them. So what we're going to eventually do, eventually being the key word, is reduce that to two opposing buds. That's what we're gonna leave the year with. Two opposing buds. The following year, those two can each have two opposing buds on those. And those two can have two, and those two can, and that's how we build pads on a tree. But back to all our buds. If when the tree we cut off that candle, boom, cut that candle, and then it puts out all of these buds. If we go off and cut that down to two early, then the energy the tree was going to put into these five buds, it will now put into those two, and those two will have all the energy they need to be absolutely enormous. Again, despite our doing kind of against the purpose. So what we're going to do is we're going to let these guys have their say. We're going to let them all go. We're not going to let them all go forever because five buds is never okay. Um, but we're going to let them go. We're going to let them go all spring and all summer. And then when they harden off, again, how do we know when these needles on these buds have hardened off? We'll know because they're dark green. The tips of them will be sharp and pointy. And if you give them a little tug, they're seated. They tug back. If they come out easy, they were still growing. So once they've hardened off, then pick two that are equal energy and cut the rest. And what we want is this. But a lot of times you won't be given two buds of equal energy that are just right next to one another and hand spoon feeding us this shape. When you start with this, what you want is two that are of equal energy. That doesn't mean the two smallest. That doesn't mean the two biggest. If the two biggest that have if the big ones are closest to alike, then go with those two. If the medium or the lesser even of the mediums or the two that are equal to strength, then go with those two. The idea is to make sure that they're kind of one doesn't dominate the other. So you go with two that are fairly equal strength, and if they're like this, you cut the rest and then wire them like that. Or if they're like this, you cut the rest and then you wire them like that. And then the next year, you cut the candle that comes off here and you cut the candle that comes off here. It sends out a bunch. It sends out a bunch. We let them grow until they harden off, and then we pick two and cut those back. So goes it. And in the meantime, we start fertilizing in the fall. Once those needles have hardened off and we can go through and cut those buds down to two, that's when we can also start resume feeding. And some people will pick up, from then until winter. Then you may pick up during winter, you may not. Um, if you pick up during winter, then you resume in spring, and that's the most important feeding of all, especially if you picked up in the winter, because when your tree switches on, it will have been yellow from winter. That's another thing. Maybe when they go dormant, they don't get as yellow. My trees don't really go as dormant, but they do get more yellow. They don't like winter anyway. Uh, this year I noticed that, I think. Um, so when spring comes around, we pick back up the fertilizer, and then we do that until we get back a little ways into spring and 30 days before. And why 30 days before candle and when? Okay, this is a small tree. Its needles are going to be the smallest. Most parts of the world, candle cutting is like July, June, July, somewhere in there. Here it's before then. It starts before then, and candle cutting is before then. But what we'll do is, if you have a larger bonsai tree, so you're still not going to want Japanese pine needles that are out here or out here. They can get this big on an adult grown tall tree, I think. And you're not going to want that. And so what you would do is you would, at the close to the beginning of candle cutting season, you would slay those guys, and then it would have the most time of the year left to regrow slightly longer of the end of shorter needle. And then if you have a show hen, then you're going to wait towards the end of candle cutting season, and by cutting those needles, it will have less time to respond, and we'll come back with the second flush that is smaller. Now, that brings us to single flush trees. Single flush trees are normally high elevation trees. They are not used to the situation where a tropical wind could strip them bare. This one is the ponderosa. It's a Ponderosa succulorum. It is from Deadwood, South Dakota. It's one of two Yamadoris that I have, and this is about a 20-year-old tree that's based on how much bark it has, which are kind of rites of passages for pine. Um, it was wild. The needles were shorter when I got it. It was probably had shorter needles still. Excuse me. It probably had shorter needles still when it was collected, because in 20 years it hadn't grown a whole lot. Where this guy was collected, 5,600 feet up, they have a growing season that's about 4 months. During that time, they stop getting water. When they get water, it's usually in the form of snow, and it's usually in the form of something that's trying to almost pull them down. Um, so that's they're used to very, very harsh conditions. They're also used to high heat conditions. 5,600 feet up, it gets quite hot at elevations like that. And so, for a very short period of time, they get a lot of sun, not much water, and then they're right back into the harsh, cold winter. So, it's a very short growing season, and both ends of it are brutal. How they've adapted is their needles will grow all season. They don't, where these elongate out and harden off at some point. These don't. These grow until they're like third year needles or something and die. They grow the entire time. They can do something else. The Japanese black pine has a fine vascular system where water turns to oxygen readily within the needles. The ponderosa has an adaptation where it can like close all of those close all of those passageways off. It can hold its water. The needles feel a little less waxy on this guy. um, it moves slower. The metabolism of the tree is so much slower in everything it does. Now, it might be that in captivity, like the trees that I have on the balcony that we've started, they might be quite a bit, they might be a little different. But here, uh, with trees that are growing in their own environment, these guys move at a different pace. They'll make roots and shoot one off down the crack of a rock and try to start stocking up some reserves in case something goes bad. And then they'll totally live off that root and kill it. um, just tap its reserve until it's gone and start working on another one. They can also take the roots that are basically around them and lock those guys down to where as the moisture around them dries off, it doesn't leach the moisture out of them. So at that point, it'll say, I've locked off the roots around me. They're shut off, like gone into some dormant state. And then some of these Aaron roots that we've got zinging off in different directions, in cracks and rocks and stuff, we're going to live off those guys and work that angle for a while. And when they're spent, we'll start over on some new ones and maybe we'll get some rain by that time. And that's just kind of how, when collected, the history below the ground tells this story of all of the different things this tree will have done over the years to keep its game going. So let's say we collected this tree from the wild, out of the mountains, and when we found it, it had really sharp needles because its condition and its growing conditions were really harsh. And so we go, wow, that's fantastic. It already looks like a natural bonsai. It's small. It's had its butt whipped and that's stunted its growth, and it has these tiny little needles. So we bring it home and we water it and we feed it. And the next thing that happens is the following spring comes out and it back buds a whole lot, and then the needles grow long, and we go, oh, holy crud, we didn't want that to happen. Well, that was a good thing. So let's back that up a minute. Let's say we collected a Yamadori tree or a single flush pine. Could be uh, could be this or a Scots or something like that. A single flush pine, and it has sharp needles. So we bring it home, and the following year it starts pushing out new growth. That's something we want to see. We want to see if, with the amount of root mass it has, whether or not it pushes out new growth. Because as a collected tree, it may not have enough root mass to put out to push out new growth. It may be saying, "Hey, you got me in this box here, and we're just going to take what we got and photosynthesize with that for a minute, and we're going to try to fill this box up with some more roots, and we'll get back with you." Well, that's fine. So the following year, then year two, when you see the tree pushing out new growth, you know that it has enough energy to sustain, and it's telling you that it would like to increase it. I've got enough to continue, and so we're going to look at expanding our territory a little bit. On a collected tree, 1 or 2 years, just kind of take that little caveat for what it is. So, say year one, spring comes around, the tree is pushing out new growth, and it's a single flush tree. When it starts putting out new candles, we don't cut them. Uh, we let them go. We feed the tree. We feed the tree from fall to spring. I say from fall to spring because a lot of places all over the country, they're going to pick up their feed or stop feeding in the winter. I've already gone into that. I don't necessarily, either a waste or it helps, but it doesn't hurt. Um, We feed the trees. We don't stop feeding it. We don't cut the candles. So because of that, the roots grow. And when the roots grow more, that causes the tree to back bud more. And when the tree back buds more, like we already said, the first round of candles, I mean, the first round of needles that it put out on our watch were already going to be longer because we started watering it and feeding it. Two things that it's really hadn't been used to in its life up until now would be some sort of regular feeding and watering. And the reward to that is longer needles, more solar panels, which causes it to make more roots, which then causes it to make more back buds. So year two rolls around and we're seeing more back buds. We continue to feed it. The first year when we fed it, we made roots. The second year when we fed it, we were making more back buds. The third year when we feed it, we're still third year now, and we're still making more solar density. And eventually we will have a tree that can go to a show in less than 8 years, but we will have amassed the solar density needed to make it a show worthy tree along the way. So at this point, we can stop feeding it as much and we'll see that the needle size will go down because as the solar density went up, it could no longer maintain that type of solar density with that amount of needles after it back budded and then back budded and then back budded and maintain that needle length. So it begins to make smaller needles. Next year, or not next year, later in the season, when we have come to see those needles come into fall, we can go through and cut back our newest growth, not all of it. We can cut back our new growth and clean up and stall the tree. And then we will have a single flush tree with smaller needles. And we'll get that for the next couple of years. And we will have established the solar density needed to finish building the tree. And that is kind of how we get that. You also do not want to ever cut the whole candle on a single flush. I believe you want to leave some needles at the base of every candle, even when you're at a situation where you can cut the candles. When it finally does come time to do that or cut them back or something, you always want to leave at least something. Uh, so yeah, that is kind of kind of it on multi-flush and single flush pines. I know that quite often on the show I kind of hop back and forth to talking about both. Right now, we are about to roll in to the time of year when I'll start up. I'm probably a couple of weeks from picking up all the um, all the fertilizer on the trees that I'm going to do a candle cut on. On those that are further developing that aren't in a bonsai pot yet, see, that's something else. If they're in a bonsai pot, then their roots are being restricted, and that's what helps us get through the situation that I was talking about with the multi-flush. If this were in a large grow container, then the part where we're 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 going to run the roots out of energy by growing enough foliage, that wouldn't happen if it was in a larger grow container. It's only because it's in a bonsai container which restricts the roots. Now, that is not the same as being root bound. I heard somebody use that term earlier. Being root bound is a word that denotes something that is not allowing it to properly percolate water. That will cause uh, health situations as the rules don't We don't shrink the size of our trees by keeping them root bound. I have seen people keep their trees happy and healthy and have them be in the same pot for what seems like an enormous amount of time. Sometimes older trees are like that too. It's just like, yeah, it was in there for 30 years. I don't know. Just saying. I have seen large old trees that looked really nice, and they said that they had been potted for decades. Um, that might be an old tree thing. Um, as far as this is concerned, um, ponderosas, you are going to be able to get the needles fairly small on these. I've seen needles on ponderosas convincingly small for show hens, and I've heard some of the pros say they weren't sure they could do that, and they were also saying, "I'm not sure a ponderosa with these practices could ever get small enough to be a literati." Had seen that. I have seen those. They do exist. Um, the guys I hear doing that are really well on their game. But some of those guys are into bigger trees, and maybe they just haven't seen tiny little literati ponderosas that had needles that were like, you know, I think they were a good size. Um, that is it. You can do the ponderosas, for instance, a multi-flush tree. If you want to get smaller needles, there is other methods. You can cross. You can cross the. You can take grafts and put them on a ponderosa. A ponderosa has a vascular system that's considered to be very coarse, and a coarse vascular system will readily take a fine vascular system. The Japanese black pine has a fine vascular system. And I've heard it described as if you were to graft black pine onto ponderosa, which I had done to my ponderosa out on the balcony. I've heard it described that that is like putting a water hose on a fire hydrant, and not in a way that the water hose would blow it out, but in a way that the water hose would go, wow, we suddenly have more resources than we've ever had before to flourish. So yeah, that is also a good way to take a ponderosa that may or may not be suitable for your climate. Like maybe you live in more of a black pine kind of a climate than a high elevation climate. So grafting would get us around that. I only mention that because that's something that I'm currently doing and have just had returned back to the mothership here in the last 3 weeks. But this is going to conclude our talk about single and multi-flush pines and how we go about getting needles short. In Japanese black pines, we can do that over the course of a season, and you do it from season to season. It's also a good idea to not do it every season progressively. At some point, you can weaken your trees. So I think maybe two or three, maybe give it a break. If you don't, you'll see that you're running your trees into the ground. So it's a good idea to sometimes give them. Sometimes it's a good idea to give them a break from that. And as far as that's concerned, I think ponderosas make beautiful bonsais. I've heard people before in the past didn't necessarily take them as seriously over their needle length. I've always kind of agreed with that, but I found them to be beautiful at the same time. In America, if we have rugged canyon trees, they're likely to be a ponderosa or a Scots pine or a limber pine or some, those are the trees that are more likely to be hanging out of the side of a canyon, whereas a Japanese black pine is more likely to be at a garden center um, or the beach. But in the United States, I don't think they were indigenous like that. So it would be usually something that was planted Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Tomorrow we have a special show we're going to do. I'm going to go out on the balcony. It was beautiful out today. We had storms rolling in and out, but it was nice otherwise. We got a package in from the UK, and it is from my very favorite uh, bonsai potter. And so I have a show and tell to do tomorrow. We'll set up a table and point camera out at something nice, plus me, plus Frida, and we'll do a show and tell with that. I'm looking forward to that, and I appreciate you, and Frida appreciates you, and thank you so much for watching.